today's session is going to be an introduction of what open source can do for you, and also what kind of expertise we bring in to help you. Then, based on the interest we hear from you, we'll be having some more sessions which will be more one-on-one and more interactive as we get along. So what we try to do here is focus mainly on IT infra management solutions. This is what our company does. And I'm going to talk about what open source can do for you in this space. There's a lot of talk about open source, and we have been working with open source for more than 10 years now. There are a lot of products which has been evolving over a period of time. There was a time when people did not know much about open source, but now pretty much every geography, every vertical you talk about, there is interest in open source. What I'm showing here on this slide is some of the reasons why open source is becoming more and more interesting to everyone. The first thing you will hear is cost, which is saying why open source is cheaper than traditional OEM vendors which charge you a license. But one thing you have to keep in mind is open source is not just about cost. You also get a lot of additional benefits which are difficult to come by if you purchase a product from, let us say, HP or IBM. Namely, you get complete source code ownership, which means that product is never obsolete. You have complete control of that source code. You don't have dependency or lock into a particular vendor. The source code is pretty much always available, and there's never a concept of end of life. We have seen many customers who have difficulties in handling products which get into end of life. So when I talk about some of the use cases, some of the customer case studies, I will definitely mention some of those. The other part that you have to keep in mind is you get a lot of flexibility with open source. You are able to deploy it accordingly to exactly what you need at your company, right? So this is what we call tailor-made custom fit solutions. You can purchase standard OEM products out of the shelf, out of the box. They're easy to deploy and they go live very quickly. But then most of the time, you have to spend quite a bit of time and money to go and customize that solution to what exactly you want to do at your company. So if you are using something like SAP, you're using something like ServiceNow, all of that you are going to have to spend quite a bit of time to customize. Customization of a product such as SAP or things you probably have already experienced, so I'm not going to talk about that. But we also will talk about reliability, scalability, and feature completeness. So what are the trends in the open source? And the reason we are more people using open source. So when we talk to customers across the world, whether it is US, whether it is Europe, Middle East, GCC countries and Asia, everyone says that, there is an interest in open source. So either some customers have already adopted and they are using open source to adopt soon, maybe this year or next year. Then, let's figure out how. So obviously, adoption is increasing, and that's where we are seeing a lot of interest. If you talk to some of the large companies, traditional software vendors who provide enterprise software, we are talking about IBM, HP, CA, Microsoft kind of companies. All of them are already convinced about open source. So IBM tells me that, they are not going to invest in some of the traditional products anymore, but rather they are going to look at open source options. One of the projects we delivered was through IBM, and I'll talk about that use case when we get there. Likewise, we also have products from HP where they are obsoleting some of the old products. They're not investing in that anymore. We remember CA did an end of life on their product. They're not investing on that anymore. When Microsoft is launched an initiative which is called Open Source Security. So what that means, really, the world is changing in terms of the product roadmaps, in terms of technology roadmaps. Everyone, in some form or some way, is one of the questions which I keep getting from customers across the world is, what about security? Okay. So when we talk about security, a lot of people have questions. Is open source secure? Sometimes you hear different news saying that open source is not secure. Arrangement which has product in it, which has people, process, and training. You may have the best product in the world, but if the people are not handling security properly, it will easily be a security breach. In fact, most of the news that you hear, there has been a security breach because people did not know what is a security breach. So open source follows exactly the same methodology which are found in other enterprise closed source products. What this means is security must be planned as part of your overall open source solution. And I would say with a lot of confidence that security in open source is at the same level as enterprise tools that you'll find in the market. We have deployed open source in many environments. We're deployed in banks, we're deployed in pharmacies, we're deployed in government agencies where there are concerns about security. And the good news is we are able to pass audit and compliance. Yeah, you do make notes and let me know what queries you have. So yeah, so the first case study I want to talk about was pharmacy. So we had deployed open source for a pharmacy chain. They had 3,000 outlets and they had 8,000 employees. So this was a large chain which wanted to deploy some tools for streamlining their IT operation processes. They also wanted to integrate with other healthcare software which was being used as part of their system. So what we did with them was to propose a solution which had a couple of products in them. The products is called GLPI and ITSM. We did an on-premise deployment. This was pretty much a complete ITSM deployment where we had asset management, we had discovery, we had a help desk and service request, we had a purchase order process flow, we also had change management, then we had custom reports and dashboard. We also did a couple of integrations with their basic software, some of the basic POS software and some of the SAP module software. We had also raised role-based access to different departments. All this was done with open source. So this one case study, this might be interesting to some of your use cases. The second case study I wanted to point out was the work we did for a bank. So this was a very large bank. In fact, it's one of the top 10 banks in the country, which has 45,000 employees, and it has more than 2,500 retail branch outlets. The environment is very similar to what you'd find at any bank. So you have a corporate office, you have a data center, and then you have a DR site. The bank was already on a long-term roadmap to adopt open source. And of course, one of the goals was to reduce the cost, but then they also had other plans to where they want to be in terms of the technology vision. So they approached us, they wanted our help. We worked with them. This project ran for almost a year. And what we did with them was start all the way from consulting, do a complete architecture design. The number of devices is pretty large here, so we have to design something which is scalable. We were able to cover the entire IT infrastructure stack, which means we are able to do applications, we're able to do databases, we're able to do middleware, we're able to do core hardware, which is including servers, network, and storage devices. All this was designed with the HA in mind, with auditing and compliance in mind. I mentioned banks, right? So obviously this is going to be compliant, and that's quarterly audits. They go through a lot of audits by multiple government agencies. So this we are able to do with the open source products. And then we also had a deployment of an ITSM tool, which was doing an integration. With this automation, we were able to handle more than 4,000 tickets per day. And all this was done automatically. So this was part of the solution that we implemented. We also had custom dashboards that we were able to implement. Now, that's all the technology part of it, but then eventually what was the benefit the bank had? This was a major success for us in terms of showing that open source will work. If you can have open source work for a bank, that means pretty much every other vertical, it's possible to adopt open source, right? So we are able to show that you get 90% reduction license cost. You you can know the size of the bank is pretty large. So they were spending a lot of money on licenses. When we went in with open source, all of that dropped by 90%. If you look at the operating cost, we are able to reduce the operating cost by more than 30%. So here's an example where open source was able to help with both CapEx and OpEx. Case study number 3. This one we picked is from insurance sector. So we worked with a insurance, which is also a countrywide insurance. They had 10,000 employees across multiple branches in the country. What they were looking for is a way to automate some of their onboarding processes. They're spending a lot of time on onboarding, and they were pretty much getting frustrated because the company was going through a lot of growth, meaning they were hiring a lot of people and they wanted to expand very quickly. So there were situations where a new employee would come into the company and you had to wait for a month to get a laptop or a account to start working, and that was very frustrating for the company because their employees were not, productive. So they came to us and we worked with them. We designed an automated process. We wanted to make sure that all the process workflows are designed properly. Once the design is done, then there was automation done so that all the onboarding tasks are automated. Every department gets a notification. They are supposed to set up the new employee. They are given a timeline. Their SLA is measured. If they violate the SLA, that is being reported to the managers. All of this was done in such a fashion that you have integration with other HR tools and IT tools which are used by the company. The net result of this was we reduced the onboarding activity of new employees from 2 weeks down to just 3 days. And the employee satisfaction was very high. After that, we got a appreciation mail from the employee saying that, we are able to be more productive and we are able to pretty much get started immediately as we join. This was, again, open source product we deployed. This company, being an insurance, also goes through a lot of vulnerability assessment. They do a lot of auditing. They do a lot of compliance. They have to be compliant with the insurance regulatory authority, right? So it's another case where security was pretty much comfortable for the customer, and we're able to comply with what other security concerns came in. So another use case which we just rolled out, this is from telecom. So the customer is actually a leading telecom provider, and they have more than 300 million customers. Deployment we have is actually a very large scale deployment, and they wanted to have a scalable solution which can hold for next 5 years. So they came to us and said that this is the roadmap. Can you help? And here, this entire solution is actually built on cloud. It's a new generation technology, which is called NFVI. So I think some of you are in the telecom space. You will recognize what I'm talking about. So this is virtualization using OpenStack. Built on OpenStack, they deployed a lot of their telecom applications and services. Our role was to provide insight into the different part of the infra. This was helpful in terms of knowing what's the performance of the current infra, what is the capacity planning that needs to be done, is there a need to scale up or scale down, do you anticipate any bottlenecks, do you see any impact on business. All of this we are able to do, and the tools we use there were open source Prometheus, Grafana, and Elasticsearch. Here we are able to implement a completely scalable model for the monitoring analytics piece of it. We gave in-depth analytics and KPIs. We gave them correlation. We gave them reporting and dashboards. The net result is that the customer is able to look at the infra and exactly pinpoint saying this is the source of my problem today. If something goes down, I know exactly where the problem is. If a customer calls and says that my service is affected, I'm not getting a call, my internet quality is bad, the IT team knows exactly where to look because the tool is giving them insights into the performance at every layer. So this is an example of, again, a large-scale deployment, which is using open source. It is able to meet the performance needs. It's able to meet the scalability needs. And we also finished the vulnerability assessment test 2 months back. every quarter we have VAPT assessment. So just 2 months back, we finished a VAPT for this customer, and it was a thumbs up saying everything is fine. So there are a few observations which are very common. So it's very similar to what we do. Okay, so what I'm showing here is use cases based on the projects we have deployed, right? So let's look at one more sector, manufacturing. I'm sure there are a lot of customers in manufacturing in GCC as well. So we worked with a global manufacturing company. This is out of US, and they have locations. They have their factories and warehouses in Asia, Europe, and also US. And they came to us saying that, we are trying to replace legacy enterprise OEM with open source. What can be done? We started working with them for 3 years. We have been with them for since 2018. So it's the third year we have been working with them. And they also went through the entire COVID-19 pandemic like all of us. They survived, fortunately. And the open source strategy really helped them survive with that, because last year, we all know what kind of issues the world has faced. Fortunately, because of open source, they were not needed to pay any licenses, and really helped them when they had a downturn because of the COVID-19 pandemic. So here, what we did for them was, again, a complete ITSM solution, which was help desk, service desk, asset management, CMDB. We did monitoring of the entire stack. We did integration between the monitoring tools and the ITSM tools. Tickets were automatically created. It was automatically being monitored and tracked to resolution. We could measure the SLA of different applications. We could measure where the problems are, how to fix them. And then eventually we are able to also define automated workflows. It allows them to fix some of those issues much faster. The entire solution we gave was basically an alignment with their overall open source strategy. So this is not one single product alone. We have been with this customer for a very long time, as I said, 3 years. And as and when they come up with some use cases or requirements for the businesses, we come up with solutions and we deploy them. And that's how their journey has been. They're pretty happy, satisfied customers. So now let's look a little bit at some of the products and features which may then help you, right? So whenever we look at the market and we say, I want open source, but this is what I'm doing currently with SAP. This is what I'm currently doing with maybe HP or Oracle or Microsoft, right? If I move to open source, can I get all the features? That's the first question you would be asking. What about support and reliability? That's what you want to know next. Eventually, you want to be able to justify the shift. That's where you look at ROI and the cost of making a transition. Is it worth really making the transition to open source? So all these are questions that come up to your mind, right? So I'm just going to show one example that will help you get the idea on how we go about this. The example I have is a database. So I'm going to take one example of a database, which will be Postgre Sql. So Postgre Sql versus Oracle, right? So we all know Oracle has been a leader in the space for a very long time. What about Postgre Sql? How does it compare? So if we just take a look at the features and the metrics of the product itself, scalability, Postgre offers the same level of scale that you can have with Oracle. You can have millions of transactions, you can have millions of records, no issue. In terms of product releases, product patches, product updates, Postgre has a very clear release cycles of one major release every year and minor releases every quarter. If you compare Oracle, they usually wait for 2 to 4 years before they do any major releases, right? So what is the time between Oracle 12c versus 19c, all the timelines if you have been using Oracle, right? So some of the open source, they roll up very quickly. Security, Postgre offers exactly the same security levels as Oracle. It's no difference really. It gives you identity management, it gives you role-based access, it gives you all levels of data encryption that you would like to have. So it's also pretty much on par. Replication, Postgre gives you replication. For Oracle, there is a technology called Golden Gate. There is a concept called RAC, and I'm sure you've deployed all of this in your companies, right? So if you compare that with Postgre, again, it's equivalent. you have similar features. Cloud deployments is possible to have with Postgre as well as Oracle. Sometimes there are complications with licensing in Oracle that you need to keep in mind, but it's possible, right? So you know that. So if you just look at the features, the last couple of slides I showed you that features are pretty much on par, but what about the cost? The cost I'm showing here is basically based on a core or a processor, right? That's how the Oracle license works. Even if you assume a single core or a two core processor, this is the kind of costing we are looking at. If you go with Oracle Enterprise Edition, you're probably going to pay about $100,000. This is only the license cost. Whereas with PostgreSQL, you are pretty much free. And what I'm talking about is a PostgreSQL community version. So the difference between license cost is very, very clear, right? I mean, in many cases, license cost is zero if you go with the community edition. And then you have a choice to go to what is called as a enterprise edition supported version. So we can look at that option also. So this is just one data point, one example comparison I'm showing where I'm taking an example of an enterprise OEM product and comparing that with an open source product. So it's very clear what the advantages are. We can do similar comparison for a lot of other products. For each product, we can have some slides which look similar. But in the interest of time, I'm not covering all of them right now. Maybe in the future lectures, we can cover them. So what is specific to IT infra? This is what our company focuses on. This is what Altnix focuses on. We want to focus mainly on open source for IT infra. There are a lot of products out there which are open source, which are more related to business applications. They are more related to software applications like CRM, ERP. We are not looking at that right now from our company point of view. We are focusing mainly on open source for IT infra management, right? So when we say IT infra management, what do we really cover? We are typically talking about IT infra monitoring, IT service management, ITSM, automation, analytics, and operations. These are kind of the 5 buckets we look at when we talk about infra management overall. So monitoring, I'm sure this everyone knows, it's very basic concept. So whether it is bare metal hardware, all the way to databases, applications, or cloud monitoring, all of this can be done. And the good news is you don't have to buy multiple products. You don't have to buy multiple modules. Most of the open source that we work with, they're defined in such a way that one single tool gives you everything, right? So what do you mean? So in our product portfolio, we have Prometheus, we have Zabbix, we have Elasticsearch, OpenNMS, Nagios, Thanos, Logstash, and Xanos. These are all what we call open source equivalent products. Why do we see so many products? Well, the answer is it depends on the use cases you bring us. Some of the use cases, we will recommend one product for you. One product will not meet all the use cases all the time. We know that, right? So based on which vertical you are in and what kind of use case you would like to see, we would recommend one versus another. For example, if you're deploying a traditional 3G kind of a telecom infra, where you're not worried so much about applications, I would recommend OpenNMS as a solution. But if you are deploying 5G on a cloud infra for the same telecom customer, I would say you need to go with Prometheus. If you want in-depth application and database monitoring, I would recommend Zabbix or Nagios. If you want log monitoring, log correlation, log archival, I would recommend Logstash and Elasticsearch. So these products give you basically options, and they would be a matter of choice, which we will recommend based on exactly which vertical you are in and what your use cases are. So that's on the monitoring side of it. Moving forward, for IT service management, we are talking about typical asset management, CMDB, service desk incident management, process workflows, and SLA management, right? So all of this. So for this, we currently have 3 products. One of them is called OTRS. The other one is called GLPI, and then we have Jira also. So based on really what kind of use case you are going to hit, we will recommend one of these products. Currently, for a large manufacturing company, which is actually a retail shop, which has 75,000 assets, we are migrating them from ServiceNow, and the product we choose is GLPI, for example, right? So the third part of our portfolio is infra automation. So when we talk about automation, we are talking about automated provisioning, we are talking about remediation, we are talking about network automation, CI/CD, DevOps use cases, capacity optimization, and interops. So for all of these kind of use cases, we have products which are Ansible, AWX, we have Stackstorm, Jenkins, and GitHub. Now, all of these products we have worked with large customers, so we know how this works in enterprise environments. We know what kind of challenge you face. We also know what is your ecosystem. So we are able to do automation integration with all the existing products you have. For analytics, this is where the most important part is about finding trends, patterns, and reports and dashboard, right? So this is where IT analytics comes in. For analytics, we have products, and they are Grafana, one of the products we have for dashboarding. We can have Elasticsearch for log analysis and correlation. Jaspersoft and Metabase would be used for pure reporting and BI kind of use cases. So if you're using some costly BI like ClickView or Tableau, you can replace that with Metabase, for example. So they're equivalent products, they're equally powerful. The last part of it is IT operations. So we're talking about day-to-day operations, which is basically, asset lifecycle management, config management, patch management, so on. So for this, we have a few tools available. And the tools we have are basically ManageIQ, Mattermost, Spacewalk, OpenKM, Rancid. So these are some of the products which are in the IT operations space. In this presentation, I'm covering all the products in a very high level, just mentioning them right now. The next few sessions, we'll have a deep dive. We can give you more details on what each product does and what it brings to the table, how it compares with an equivalent enterprise product, and how you can benefit. Since this is the first presentation, I'm going at a very high level, and I'm kind of going a little bit quick. I'm sure you have questions. We'll answer them in the next few lectures as we get to. So if I take the complete infra story and look at how this is going to map for an open source deployment, this is typically how it might look like. So I have old infra, which is physical infra. I have VMs and virtualized infra, which is based on ESX, something that you've been using for years. Then recently, you also have the new forms of cloud infra. We are talking about IaaS and PaaS kind of platforms. So that's where you have Kubernetes, you have Docker, you have OpenStack, all of this coming in. So how do you manage them? With open source and yes, a sample stack. So you would have a combination of these tools. You would have Zabbix to give you monitoring, Grafana to give you dashboarding, Prometheus to take care of the new cloud infra. For log analysis and monitoring, you have Elk, Elasticsearch Log, Kibana. For provisioning and all the other use cases, you have ManageIQ. For ITSM and asset management, CMDB help desk, you have OTRS, for example. And to tie all of this together, you would have Ansible as an automation platform. This is a complete IT infra solution, which we have successfully deployed at other customers. So what I'm showing is not just a theoretical model, but it actually works. We have seen it work, right? So this is how you would go about building a complete architecture. So the next part of it is, this is all fine. How do I adopt it in my company and how do I take it forward? So I'm just going to give you some approaches now, and then we'll have more sessions. In the next few sessions, we'll talk about it in more detail. The first part we typically advise customers is that you have to define a roadmap. Open source is a transition which is going to take you some time. It's not like a ready-made product. If you buy a product from Microsoft or HP, you buy the software, install it, it's up and running in a month, and you're good to go. But open source, you need to spend more time. So what we recommend is look at areas where you really need to optimize the cost. Start with one simple component, and then incrementally add more modules and products to complete the solution. So what that means is do not try to do all this in one single shot. This architecture I'm showing you in one single shot is going to be difficult to execute initially. So what we do, we start with one port, one simple component, and then add modules to it to complete the solution. So always we have seen customers do this in a phase-wise manner. It works well when you do it in a phase-wise manner. Many reasons for it. First is maybe your company is new to open source, so you're adopting open source. You need to identify the methodology for rolling out open source, which is very different from what you will do from a regular enterprise product. So once you do one project, one particular module rolled out, your company and your team will know very well that this is how open source works. This is how a project in open source is deployed. This is how long it takes to deploy open source. And these are all the areas that need to be prepared before you actually adopt open source. So all of this comes from experience, right? And if you're new, we always say go one step at a time. Don't try to put everything in one single shot and make it harder for yourself, and then it may lead to challenges. So example, if you are trying to transform your ITSM, what would a typical roadmap look like? So we typically recommend start with monitoring and asset management as the first part. Then you go to incident management help desk. Then you do analytics, problem management, and change management. Once all this is working, then in the final phase, phase 4, you go to automation, workflow, system integration, capacity planning. When I talk to customers, they come back with a lot of use cases, and quite often it's not clear in their mind what's the order of priority. It helps to have an order of priority. You don't come in and say that, I want to do automation using open source right away, because it's not feasible unless you have the other phases, phase 1, 2, 3 done. You need to have all the building blocks in place, the basic building blocks in place, before you talk about something as complicated as automation, right? So that's what we recommend, going in phases. Don't do everything in one single shot. The timelines between phase 1, 2, 3, 4, that is something you can define. That's up to you, how you want to be aggressive, but at least that has to be an approach. The second part of adopting is going to be training and learning. Now, most of the tools I showed you in the previous slides are all going to be tools which are new to you, which are new to your company. I'm sure your company has a lot of people who have been working on traditional paid products. When I say paid, I'm saying enterprise traditional products. Example, you would have somebody who has worked on Microsoft, somebody worked on HP, right? You know all of that because this is what you've been using for the past 15, 20 years. But when going out of that portfolio and you're moving to a new portfolio, which is open source, you need to spend time learning and training. So this is something which has to be spent in terms of time. Your team, your company needs to learn new tools, which means you need to invest in training and learning. Okay. A lot of times people have a wrong idea that open source means you do it yourself. If you want to save time and also you don't want to get frustrated, I would recommend you take help from vendors who are good at open source. Take their help and make sure that you learn from the experts, and then you do the adoption internally. So I've seen customers, many customers, they have take the approach saying, it's open source, everything is available on the net, I can read up, I can do Google, I can do it on my own. What happens really is you are actually learning the hard way. One smart way to do this is to get trained by the guys who are the experts, and then you do the implementation yourself, right? Don't try to take any shortcuts, because this is going to be a long-term transformation you are making. It's not a short-term, one-time approach you are doing right now, but you just take the technology, learn it, and then your team is going to adopt it for the final long-term. And I've seen plenty of cases where customers don't have the skills which are needed for adopting open source. So they think that open source means the same way as Microsoft, you go buy a CD or download a software, click, you are done with installation, you're up and running. Open source does not work that way quite often. And you may learn the hard way, which will be very frustrating to your team. So plan to spend some time on training and learning all the new tools before you jump in any of these projects. Now, the next part of it is using the partner ecosystem. If you're new to open source, Take the help of partners. There are a lot of partners out there. Altnix is one example. Take their help to consult and help you with your open source journey. Okay. Make sure you have the right partners, and make sure that you communicate with them what your business roadmap is. Maybe you got some directions from your senior management, what you want to do with your technologies. Maybe they told you that, do this kind of cost optimization. Maybe they're given a target, what the cost should be. Maybe they told you that from tomorrow onwards, we are going to stop using enterprise licenses and pick and choose open source, right? This is all something we hear from customers. Don't look at partners as just resellers, because open source, hardly you will find license costs many places. So most of the partners are actually implementation partners or consulting partners, right? So communicate with them what your roadmap is, what your business goals are. Take them into confidence as a business consultant first. Work with them to work out a plan on how you're going to adopt open source. So it's going to be important that you have a strong partner ecosystem helping you out. Then you need to figure out what your strategy is going to be. If you're part of the IT team, the company is going to come to you. If you're head of IT, they're going to come to you. They're going to give you goals. This is the kind of application you want to run, and all this needs to run on open source. I don't know how. Please help, right? So you need to spend quite a bit of time with consulting what the right products are, what the right approach to the solution is, and does it really make sense to adopt a particular product from the open source world. So there's going to be a lot of consulting you need to do to your company, to the rest of the stakeholders at your company. That's something you need to spend quite a bit of time. Then you need to build the architecture around it. The architecture for open source is sometimes different from what you would see in non-open source world. For example, high availability. I'm giving a trivial example. A lot of products try to use technologies which are open source by nature. So if you go and look at high availability, the products will have a different architecture in open source world compared to enterprise products. So you need to understand all of that, and that should be part of your overall architecture design. And then eventually you do deployments, right? So that's where you have to be prepared with a plan to get your team trained. If your team is not ready, then take help from the external vendors and partners. So all that you have to plan out so that you are able to deploy in the time frame that you are expecting to go live. And then you need a plan for servicing and support. Are you going to do it yourself, or you're comfortable saying, I'm going to give it to somebody else to do it outside? I need a partner. I need a support agent who can help. So all this is something that you have to plan for before you start taking the dive into open source. So these are high-level thoughts. In conclusion, we believe that open source is the future. That's why we are betting on it, and that's why we are focused on open source. And we are seeing more and more customers jump towards open source. It's a lot of interest for various reasons. And cost savings, we have proven in multiple places that you are going to get the benefit of cost, provided you plan your adoption of open source carefully. You have to make the right choice of solutioning. You have to make the right choice of products. You have to have a right strategy for adopting the open source. Then eventually it's going to be successful. I've also seen projects with some customers who kind of try it for the sake of trial and error and then give it up. And usually the reason is because they have not planned that transition. Going from enterprise regular OEM to open source is a big change. It's a big change for a company. It's a big change for people who are working on the technology. And that should be also change in processes. That should be change in training. This is something that you have to be prepared. So that's basically my last point. Be careful with your adoption. If you plan for it, then I'm sure it will all work for you. It will be successful. As a company, we are here to help.